Hereby, I open this academic ceremony of Maastricht University, in which Alice Michaela Draghici will defend the academic thesis entitled Tax Compliance at the Crossroads, a study into issues of tax policy, compliance, and administration in connection with the income taxation of collaborative economy platform workers. Dear candidate, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, distinguished prorector. Esteemed members of the Corona, esteemed supervisors, dear colleagues, family, and friends. In 2018, I began my research on the income tax compliance challenges revolving around the collaborative economy, starting from the predicate of some basic societal observations related to the emergence and growth of this business model. The collaborative economy is one of the many business models to have emerged as a result of digitalization. It involves web-based platforms which provide an interface that allows individual end users to connect with individual workers for the supply and receipt of various peer-to-peer services. There is a considerable measure of economic interchangeability between services supplied by individuals on a peer-to-peer basis through platforms and similar services which are available outside the sphere of the collaborative economy. Essentially, the collaborative economy prompts individuals to mobilize the idle or underused capacity of private assets and to use these with a view to generating income. And although as a result of the collaborative economy, peer-to-peer activities have become an increasingly prevalent stream for the generation of income, both conventional and empirical wisdom stand to suggest that income derived from such activities often goes underreported and ultimately undertaxed. So against this backdrop, the key research objective of my thesis refers to the identification and discussion of various possible approaches towards addressing the effective income taxation of collaborative economy platform workers. In support of this key research objective, my thesis builds on a number of sub-questions. Firstly, my thesis discusses the business model of the collaborative economy and the particularities of platform workers with a view to identifying those factors and characteristics which may act to create barriers or to obfuscate the effective taxation of income derived by individuals in the collaborative economy. Additionally, my thesis discusses existing and proposed measures introduced or contemplated with a view to addressing the income taxation of platform workers and comments on the respective merits and shortcomings of these. Finally, my research also reflects on the respective roles of international governmental organizations, tax administrations, and platform operators in the ongoing strides towards addressing the effective taxation of income derived by platform workers. As part of my research, I argued that the undertaxation of platform workers is a multifaceted issue rooted in a number of distinct but ultimately commingled factors. Firstly, in the eyes of the law, platform workers are generally treated as micro-entrepreneurs. In spite of the fact that the activities of these individuals are merely quasi-formal in their nature, they are generally subject to extensive tax obligations and compliance costs, which tend to be disproportionate in the face of the nature and scale of these activities. Tax laws are generally constructed on the basis of dichotomies. They distinguish in binary terms between activities that have a formal or an informal character. It is difficult to bring within these categories activities that are not readily either one or the other. This is problematic in light of the ongoing growth of the collaborative economy, but more broadly, it is problematic in light of the overarching objective of personal income tax rules to amount to a broad-based tax that captures the totality of the flows of income pertaining to individuals. For personal income tax rules to attain this objective, they must be capable of reflecting and accommodating in an intuitive manner all types of income-generating arrangements in which individuals may participate. A separate issue relates to the fact that the collaborative economy itself creates or harbors a number of circumstantial opportunities for non-compliance as available to workers. Notably, in many cases, the activities of workers are simply unknown to tax administrations. So this means that platform workers are equipped to leverage their visibility deficit and the informational disadvantage of tax administrations with the view to misrepresenting income, expenses, and other circumstances relevant to the determination of their tax liability. A separate issue refers to the fact that many workers often lack a full understanding of the tax obligations that pertain to them, which may further undermine the quality of taxpayer self-reporting. As a third issue, the income tax compliance frameworks that apply in respect of platform workers are deeply reliant on voluntary taxpayer compliance and therefore on the behavior of taxpayers. In many cases, platform workers are liable to engage in aggressive, risk-taking behavior under the knowledge that non-compliance is unlikely to be detected or enforced. Moreover, many workers approach their tax obligations with negligence, which may determine inadvertent non-compliance. And finally, because of the temporal disconnect between taxable events and the actual payment of tax, there is a tendency for platform workers to perceive tax obligations and the payment of tax as an economic loss. This may also determine liquidity issues when taxpayers attempt to discharge tax payments. So at the end of the day, the collaborative economy harbors a number of circumstances and encourages behaviors which are antithetical to the effective functioning of compliance frameworks that rely so heavily on voluntary taxpayer compliance. In the few years since the emergence of the collaborative economy, policymakers in various states have either introduced or contemplated various measures for addressing the income taxation of platform workers. For example, some states have introduced exemptions in respect of part of the income earned by these individuals. But these measures are a compromise by their very nature and not an answer or a solution to the question of how the income derived by platform workers should be effectively captured within the net of taxation. Spearheaded by the OECD, tax administrations in many states have introduced taxpayer engagement and education initiatives. The purpose of these is to softly raise workers' awareness towards their tax obligations. But there is widespread consensus that the effect of these initiatives on compliance behavior and compliance outcomes tends to be quite modest. One type of measure which has become increasingly popular in recent years refers to the introduction of third-party information reporting requirements. These require that an intermediary, which will normally be the platform for which workers perform their activities, be required to report on an ongoing basis information about the identities and the incomes of workers. In having this information at its disposal, tax administrations are purportedly better equipped to exercise oversight, supervision, and enforcement. Moreover, tax administrations in some states rely on information received pursuant to these instruments with a view to providing partially pre-populated tax returns to workers. Finally, one type of measure, which arguably stands as an outlier, refers to the collection of tax through withholding. This entails that an intermediary involved in the processing of payments derived by workers for their activities be required to withhold part of that payment and remit it to the tax administration as a payment or prepayment of tax on the worker's behalf. However, I argue as part of my thesis that there tend to be considerable challenges to the scalability of such measures. Despite the ongoing adoption and implementation of measures, the undertaxation of platform workers remains a persisting issue, and I surmise that there are at least two broad reasons behind this. One reason refers to the fact that there is a pervasively misguided viewpoint taken by policymakers at both the domestic and international level that any type of measure could provide a one-size-fits-all solution. This viewpoint is mistaken because it discounts the true heterogeneity which is at play in the collaborative economy. Platform workers derive income under markedly different circumstances, and these should be reflected as part of the measures contemplated for addressing their income taxation. There are considerable differences in the circumstances and profitability of labor and capital-intensive activities performed through platforms. Moreover, casuistic considerations and choices made by workers as to the manner and the scale or frequency with which they perform activities may also determine important differences, which should be accounted for. A separate issue relates to the fact that most measures, either introduced or contemplated by policymakers, tend to focus primarily on a specific determinant of non-compliance, discounting the other ones. This is an issue because the under-taxation of platform workers is the composite product of at least 3 determinants of non-compliance. These being the circumstantial opportunities for non-compliance available to workers, the behavioral considerations that may impair compliance, and in many cases, the weaknesses in the regulatory frameworks applied across states. As a core proposition of my thesis, I argued that the income taxation of platform workers should be addressed through the lens of compliance by design. Compliance by design was originally surmised by the OECD in 2014 as part of a narrower policy discussion related to the taxation of SMEs and sole proprietorships. According to the OECD, compliance by design entails that income tax rules and the compliance frameworks that underpin these should be directly conducive to compliance and concurrently capable of absorbing opportunities for non-compliance. A core precept in attaining compliance by design refers to safeguarding a temporal alignment between taxable events and the recording or materialization of the tax consequences of these. And broadly speaking, there are 2 main ways in which this could be achieved. One way would be through a broadened focus on outcome determinative measures. The most obvious such measure is an increased focus on the collection of tax through withholding. When tax is collected through withholding, indeed, the obligation to remit tax payments is reassigned on a structural level from a personal obligation of the taxpayer to an obligation applied in respect of a third-party intermediary. This acts to remove compliance choices from taxpayers' hands. But more broadly, and arguably more importantly, compliance by design also presupposes that there should be an increased deployment of compliance assistance tools directly as part of the technological infrastructure that is used by taxpayers for the regular and ordinary performance of their income-generating activities. This would allow all the circumstances relevant to the determination of a tax liability to be recorded in real time and on a comprehensive basis and translated into a format which can form the basis for an accurate determination of the tax liability. Arguably, the importance of bringing compliance by design to the forefront is especially notable at the present time in light of the recent adoption and implementation of DAC 7 in the EU and the OECD model rules on reporting by platform operators. These instruments establish multilateral frameworks for third-party information reporting in respect of platform operators in the collaborative economy. The key advantage of these measures is that they act to overcome the otherwise relevant limitations of unilateral third-party information reporting arrangements. In this respect, having such measures in place has become increasingly convenient. However, the convenience with which such measures are now applied is liable to cloud the inherent limitations that are at play with them. Third-party information reporting itself is not a measure which can be directly conducive to compliance. So with this in mind, I argue that despite and alongside the application of third-party information reporting, policymakers should continue to ponder approaches for safeguarding the effective taxation of platform workers in the spirit of compliance by design. Finally, in a broader sense, it is important to recall that although digitalization has already brought about considerable shifts in the patterns of economic activity and income-generating activities for individuals, we are arguably still in the very early days of digitalization. It is quite likely that collaborative economy platform workers are only a first manifestation of a broader impending shift in such patterns. So with this in mind, I argue that policymakers, as they are currently pondering approaches geared towards platform workers, should also focus on the flexibility of these measures and their scalability and their capability to respond and to be adapted to the challenges that are likely to be posed in the near future by similar but not identical emerging hard-to-tax groups. I thank the Prorector for the opportunity to give this introduction, and I give the floor back to you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Luya. Professor Luya is Professor of Comparative Tax Law at our university, and he is also the chair of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, your book surprised me in more ways than one. It's a good written book on a very topical issue, the taxation of collaborative economy, especially platform workers. Now, in the first part of the book, you spend a lot of pages, of course 676 in total, and you spend a lot of pages on explaining to us that if you take a look at income tax laws as they are, labor tax laws, a bit of international taxation, that it's a bit of a mess, at least that we have no real clear answer on how to tax economy platform workers, whether they would be small entrepreneurs or maybe they should be looked at as employees. So in a book of that size, looking from a comparative tax law perspective, the first thing I was wondering, okay, this is focusing on income tax. This is focusing on labor taxes. Shouldn't you have also looked at other taxes like VAT, for instance? Because there we have similar questions coming up. More importantly, if you conclude after a few hundred pages that there is an unclear answer, it would also have been, one would have expected someone to look at labor law, to look at European law on this matter, to look at social security law, to find other fields to get a clear answer. Now, to your credit, if you would have done that, you would have still been at a loss. Because up to now, we are still having no clear answers on how to tax these platform economy workers. Issues were at the Dutch Supreme Court yesterday, at the European Court just a month ago, there were cases, and we're still looking for an answer. So I think that as you already put on paper 676 pages, I think your excuse of looking into labor law and social security law for this time around. But then still, if we can agree that even if you would have looked there, it's quite unclear where we should go with defining how platform economy workers should be taxed. That brings me to the second part of your thesis, where you go a long way in saying, okay, simplified rules would have been helpful. But still, if I listened to you correctly, and also listened to your presentation from just a few minutes ago, even if we had simplified rules, you're going to bet on compliance by design, because you do not seem to believe that people would voluntarily declare what they are supposed to declare. Even if the rules were clear. Now they often have an excuse because you don't know what to declare. But even if the rules were clear, when I read you, I read everything. You use the word the social contract, which is a very loaded term. You use it more than a few times. It is a philosophical term. And your conclusion time and again is that you cannot rely on people to fill in their taxes truthfully. And I read that not one time. I think if I use all different phrases, you did it 30 times in the book.
At least.
Yes. So that, as far as that's confirmation then. But still, my question to you is, why do you think that? Only yesterday, more than 1 million Dutch people tried to file their tax files and they couldn't do so. People voluntarily wanted to comply. My question to you is, looking at this book, the conclusion that you made with regard to voluntary compliance and your conclusions that people will probably not do so, to what extent has it to do with cultural aspects and the way that you perceive society?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for this question. If my understanding is correct, you have two questions which hinge on different issues. First on, or secondly rather, on voluntary compliance, and separately on the intertwinement between the income tax issues that are at play and the ones that pertain to other areas of law, specifically labor law. Labor law, in my view, is an interesting aspect when it comes to the collaborative economy, because there is a lot of discussion about issues of worker classification in that environment. I argue in my thesis quite adamantly that worker classification or misclassification may be an issue in some situations, and there are indeed some platform workers which are improperly assigned by platforms as independent contractors, and therefore the income tax obligations that apply to them, but also their rights or lack thereof under labor law and social security also flow from self-employment status, when in fact, in substance, the relationship between the worker and the platform is more substantively one of employment. Now, what I argue is that issues of worker misclassification should not necessarily be overstated. The future of this is also uncertain at the present time. The European Commission is tabling a proposal for improving working conditions as part of the platform economy. The first proposal was submitted already in December 2021. It establishes a list of 5 criteria on the relationship of control between a platform worker and a platform. If 2 of those criteria are fulfilled, then a rebuttable presumption of employment is established. That, of course, can be rebutted by the platform. But at the present time, the negotiations on this directive are at a stalemate. Just in December 2022, one of the committees of the European Parliament, the one on employment and fair working conditions, proposed a completely different version of this text, wherein we would not even have a binding list of criteria that could be relied on to establish this rebuttable presumption. Some member states, for example, the Czech Republic, have recently proposed a different version of the proposal with still with a number of criteria, 7 in that case, out of which 3 would be sufficient to establish a rebuttable presumption. But at the present time, negotiations on this are at a stalemate. Now, I mentioned this because as part of the explanatory memorandum to the directive and in the preamble to the directive, the Commission notably mentioned 2 important factors. It mentioned that this instrument does not target genuine self-employment as part of the collaborative economy, only sham self-employment arrangements. And it also mentioned that tax authorities, for example, should also be able to rely on the presumption of employment as established for labor law purposes as part of that instrument. What the fate of this will be, I can only speculate on this because we do not know where these negotiations will go and what the final version of the instrument will be. I comment briefly as part of my thesis that one problem with the employee question lies specifically in the fact that it's a threshold question. We find whether a person is an employee by reference to tests of control and economic dependency in relation to a principal. And these tests, like any threshold tests, will always encourage behavior aimed at staying below the threshold, in this case on the part of platform operators. But it is quite likely that many platform workers may be reclassified as soon as these instruments come into force, whenever the case may be that this will happen. And this will likely also have consequences for income tax purposes. However, and of course, when it comes to employees, the reason for why their income taxation is oftentimes not contentious is specifically because they are addressed under wage tax frameworks, which, as the OECD also describes them, are compliance by design arrangements. Tax in respect of employment income is collected on a periodic basis through pay-as-you-earn. Ideally, that could also happen in regards to platform workers. However, my key argument as part of the thesis is that tax law developments do not necessarily have to wait on labor law developments. Technically, there are possibilities, although difficult, to also introduce withholding regimes for collaborative economy platform workers for income tax purposes, even if these are not treated as employees. There is no structural reason for why there cannot be withholding taxes in this area. Whether that is appropriate and easy to achieve in all cases is, of course, a different question. Now, as regards the second part of your question on voluntary compliance and the term social contract, which I also use a few times in my thesis, and you are absolutely correct in remarking that I am quite critical of this. And in fact, a few times in my thesis, I refer to voluntary compliance itself as a term of convenience or a house of cards. The reason for this is because my view is that the emphasis on voluntary compliance is rooted in necessity and convenience, but also very much in the legal nature of taxes. taxes are a very special area of the law in the sense that they establish obligations that legal subjects have to go out of their way to meet. It is not tenable for tax administrations to enforce compliance in respect of all legal subjects because everybody is a taxpayer for the purposes of income tax rules. All individuals are taxpayers in that area. So the enforcement and the compliance question is far more burdensome in the area of tax law than it is in many other areas of law. For example, in criminal law, most people do not have to worry about enforcement questions there because it's not an area of the law that you engage with on a day-to-day basis, unlike what we see with tax law. So the concept of voluntary compliance historically was first used by the IRS in the United States, and it did always allude to the notion of a social contract and an obligation that is inherent in discharging tax payments without being compelled to do so. Whether or not voluntary compliance is always tenable, I think the collaborative economy shows that this is not necessarily always the case. And in the case of small-scale taxpayers that have engaged in activities that are of a high volume but a low value, the opportunities for non-compliance are considerable. And the emphasis on voluntary compliance in that area is elusive and, in my view, not entirely appropriate, which is also part of the reason why I express preference for compliance by design. I hope that answers your questions.
It does answer my question, and it gives rise for further discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor van de Vijver, who is Professor of Tax Law at the Universiteit Antwerpen and who is also a member of the Assessment Committee. And I would like to welcome her very much to Maastricht University today. Very good to have you here with us.
Thank you very much. Ms. Draghici, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like also to thank you very much for inviting me to be a member of this jury. This offered me the opportunity to read your excellent manuscript into detail, and I really enjoyed the reading. I have very much appreciated your research for 3 main reasons: holistic, critical, and balanced. I think you really took an holistic approach by integrating law as well as a behavioral approach to your research topic. I also think, as expected from a researcher, that you were really very critical in your research. For example, you claim that the current tendency to rely on third-party data or the role of platform operators is maybe a little too broad. And then balanced. I think that you acknowledge, as you also said during your introduction, that there is really not a miracle solution, and so you propose various solutions. And what I also really appreciate in your conclusions is that you also provide guidance on how to combine or prioritize certain measures, also depending on the cultural context. And when I was reading your thesis, and especially also the different behavioral models that you discuss in your thesis, it also reminded me of the fraud triangle. And the fraud triangle is a theory that tries to give an explanation of why people try to commit fraud. And in literature, the fraud triangle has been used so far to try to explain compliance or non-compliance, mainly in the financial context or in the accounting context. And I think it may also be a useful theory or a useful model to use in the tax context. And so what I would like to do with you, or my questions, relate to what extent your research has in fact covered the different factors that are identified in this fraud triangle model. And so the fraud triangle model identifies 3 factors that explain why people are compliant or why people are not compliant. And I think that your PhD mainly focuses on the first factor, which is a perceived opportunity to cheat. When people have the perception that I have opportunities here to be non-compliant, then I will take use of these opportunities. And you also identified in the context of platform workers different opportunities, especially the fact that these taxpayers have to report their taxable income themselves. And so what I understand is as a suggestion that you are trying to find solutions, you are trying to find measures to reduce this opportunity to be non-compliant. And so your idea with respect to the withholding tax obligations really is an example of that, because that reduces the opportunity to be non-compliant. My questions relate to the two other factors of the fraud triangle, and the first factor is financial pressure or incentive. For taxpayers, when they, or in general people, when they feel a certain pressure, a certain financial pressure, sometimes that brings them to non-compliant behavior simply because they, for example, they face financial problems, they don't have the financial means to be compliant, so this financial pressure brings them to non-compliance. Or alternatively, incentive, when they see a possibility, an incentive related to this non-compliant behavior, this will also instigate them towards this non-compliant behavior. If you apply this in the tax context, we can see that certain taxpayers probably also are non-compliant simply because they face financial hardship, and they see no other way as to be non-compliant. Or otherwise, another example could be that simply by paying not your taxes, of course, you have the idea that you save money, and that this is the reason why you are not compliant. Now, in order to address this factor, suggestions are twofold. The first one is to increase penalties, because this reduces your incentive, because maybe you don't pay taxes now, but then afterwards you will face high penalties. So this reduces the incentive that is linked to being non-compliant. And the other one is to increase audits, because this also increases the risk that you will lose your incentive, and so bottom line, this reduces your overall incentive. So my first question is, do you consider this approach also as a feasible approach for platform workers? High penalties and more tax audits, maybe with the help of new technologies. Like in Belgium, for example, we know that tax authorities are web scraping the platforms in order to be able to target their audits and to do effective audits. So that's the first question, and then the second question relates to the third factor, which is rationalization of the planned action. The fraud triangle also explains that people, when they commit non-compliant behavior, they want to feel good about themselves, and so they have to rationalize why they commit this non-compliant behavior. And so typically in the tax context, the rationalization that we hear a lot is, well, I am the last question, I am non-compliant because the tax system is not fair. This tax system is not fair, there is no equity, and so the fact that I am not paying my taxes is fine, because it wouldn't be fair. So my second question is, do you consider this mechanism of rationalization also relevant in the context of non-compliance of platform workers, and how could policymakers take into account this mechanism in order to address non-compliance? Thank you.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for this question. Well, these questions, really. And thank you for remarking on this part of my thesis, because it's actually the one that I took the most pleasure in writing, specifically because it shows that tax law and tax compliance is not a legal question as much as it is also a behavioral one. So with this in mind, and because this also matches the way I've always thought about these issues, I will try to answer both of your questions together. Now, as regards the opportunity for non-compliance, the perceived low opportunity cost of non-compliance, and how this is penalized, you are absolutely correct, and all the scholarship on this topic, I completely agree with it, that it shows a deep weakness that is at play in income tax compliance frameworks, which goes back to what I was mentioning a moment ago, namely the reliance on voluntary compliance. There is quite a bit of consensus that applying penalties for non-compliance, especially when non-compliance could also be the result of a taxpayer simply not having the liquidity to pay tax, is arguably paradoxical. All enforcement measures, not just applying penalties, but also auditing, which now can be done, can be scaled considerably. Most tax administrations indeed use artificial intelligence for the purposes of risk modeling from the outset, and this also optimizes auditing. But the fact that enforcement is still so prevalent does also show the lapses and the gaps that are at play, rooted in the fact that we rely quite heavily on voluntary compliance, which in turn makes us dependent on the conduct and the behavior of the taxpayers. Now, specifically to link this with your second question on the perceptions of fairness and equity of the tax system and how this can influence compliance behavior, what I try to do as part of my argumentation on this topic in my manuscript is to distinguish as clearly as possible between the issue of real behavior and attitudes. Because, of course, behavior is largely informed in many cases by attitudes. This is also the reason for why tax morale is such a prevalent concept, and it's one that is invoked by tax administrations quite often. It's also the reason for why the obligation to pay tax is often presented as part of a social contract. And there is quite a bit of literature, especially by Valerie Braithwaite, that argues that there does exist an important relationship between attitudes towards compliance and the real behavior of taxpayers, the real decisions that they make and their real conduct in how they approach their tax obligations. But even Valerie Braithwaite herself acknowledges that this relationship is not direct. It is not a one-to-one relationship in all cases. So attitude indeed influences behavior, but it's not a precise or a perfect relationship between the two. Indeed, though, the fact that we need enforcement still so heavily, the fact that many of the measures that we have deployed as part of the collaborative economy, including the increased focus on third-party information reporting, whose effect is really not only related to improving the oversight capabilities of tax administrations, but largely also to influencing the behavior of taxpayers, to discouraging taxpayers from misrepresenting income, which of course they will when they know that their information is subject to reporting. But again, my main grapple with this is that it's another exercise in shifting the incidence of the behavior of taxpayers, more so than an effort to mitigate the influence that behavior has over the question of tax compliance in the first place. Again, this is the reason for why I argue so strongly in favor of naturalizing compliance processes to some extent, because for as long as tax compliance is largely human, which has a wonderful element to it, and it makes it so that taxpayers are also engaged with the system and engaged with their obligations. But as long as there is such a deep reliance on the behavior and the conduct of individuals, these gaps will always be there. And most likely the way in which they will be addressed will continue to be through the application of penalties, through the application of other enforcement mechanisms such as auditing. And even as part of the collaborative economy, I would hazard to say that the result and the effectiveness of these will be the same as what we've seen since time immemorial when these were first introduced.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Beretta, who is assistant professor in indirect taxation at the Universiteit van Amsterdam. and who is also a member of the assessment committee. And I would like to welcome him also very much to Maastricht University today. Good to have you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me at this committee, and I would like also to join other members of this panel to congratulate you, Mr. Draghici, for your defense and for your thesis, which I appreciated in reading, although it is not an easy reading, I would say, at least in the volume of pages, as it was underlined before. And also, of course, I appreciated the topic and the focus on the collaborative economy. As you may know, is also one of, at the heart of my research, because I wrote my PhD thesis and then a book on the collaborative economy, or whatever you may want to call it, because we still don't know how to call it, because before there was approach about collaborative economy, then we switched to sharing economy, gig economy, and now with the most recent VIDA proposal published on the 8th of December of last year, now it seems that the term is platform economy. So we still, are in search of the correct terminology. But besides this issue, so of course I read with pleasure the thesis. But beside the nomenclature, so to speak, so the issue about the wording, the appropriate wording, I wonder, and so I come just straight to my question to you. I wonder whether actually your thesis is really about the collaborative economy. Because I ask that because it seems to me, by reading your analysis and your research, which is very critical, and I appreciated that, because I think that our research, a PhD students and then hopefully a researcher will need to be critical, in his approach, although perhaps not every passage, not every single statement or conclusion is agreeable. But I appreciate this criticism, and it was also underlined before in your thesis. So my question is really about your thesis the collaborative economy, or is more related a new form of collecting taxes, because this is about tax compliance? And I wonder, I'm asking myself, before posing the question to you, because actually you started your research before the COVID-19. But then, with the COVID-19, the world has changed. So I'm not sure whether what we see with the collaborative economy is still up to date. Because I think that actually what we see now is a world of work from everywhere scenario. So basically, the point that you address, so for instance, the distinction between employment and self-employed person, it become blurred and blurred, but not only in the realm of collaborative economy, and by the way, what is the perimeter of the collaborative economy, but also, but in general, for everyone. A lawyer can now work, from everywhere, just with a laptop. So, and also you include in the collaborative economy also freelancer, for instance. So, what is the distinction between employee and employed, for instance? And we have also a number of hybrid categories. So my question to you is it possible, feasible for you to extend your approach, your suggestion, also to the broader than the sharing or collaborative economy, as you may want to call it? Is it possible to extend your conclusion, the suggestion that you made at the end of the book, so basically automated reporting, as far as I understood it, and also withholding by banks and financial institutions, and I'm very skeptical about that, really, to this new world. So, which is not only about the collaborative economy as such, is basically could point to everywhere, and also in a scenario which is not necessarily a domestic scenario. It could be a, a cross-border scenario. Potentially, you have a platform in one place, and people, all dispersed all around the world, and also changing location during the same year. So, how do you see it?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for this question. And thank you as well for remarking on the definitional issue, because that is one of the key problems, and I specifically addressed it as part of my introduction, because it's something that I had to ascertain for myself. With the different definitions of the collaborative economy, there are a few reasons for why they can be so convoluted. And the reality is most of them are not real legal reasons. They are mostly commercial-related reasons. The most notable of these, for the sake of time, is also the fact that the term itself, collaborative economy, has largely become a bit of a buzzword. So it's difficult with that to know what actually falls within the scope of this concept and what falls outside of it. Indeed, when I started my research on this topic before COVID-19, it was appropriate to apply a definition of the collaborative economy, which focuses on activities that are largely performed on a peer-to-peer basis. And what I emphasized as a core characteristic of these arrangements is that individuals use what would generally be private assets as part of the performance of these services. As a side note, a similar question here would be whether the activities involving the sale of goods should be treated as part of this. In my opinion, not necessarily, because that's not sharing, it's not collaborating, it's a pure transfer of ownership. The European Commission seemingly disagrees as part of DAC 7, although in older documents it did specifically exclude activities involving the sale of goods from its own definition of the collaborative economy as part of the original agenda on this topic. But I argue as part of my conclusions quite vehemently that what we see today with collaborative economy platform workers, whom I describe as a hard-to-tax group, which is also a very old concept. It's a concept that was originally used by Richard Musgrave in somewhere around the second half of the 20th century as part of the series on reports on the tax administration challenges in developing Latin American countries. And the reason for why I relied on this term when referring to platform workers is because of the similarities in the challenges that they pose. And indeed, the issues that are posed by platform workers are definitely not unique. They are perhaps more visible now by reason of digitalization. Also by reason of digitalization, there are arguably better opportunities to capture these activities within the net of taxation, more so than when Musgrave was discussing these topics and focusing on how they could be addressed merely through presumptive taxation techniques, not necessarily also through improving compliance frameworks. So I completely agree with you that the focus in thinking about the collaborative economy today should largely be on scalability, because these types of working arrangements are evolving, and they are evolving quite rapidly. And indeed, the definition that I apply for myself of the collaborative economy is also growing increasingly narrow, because now the main focus is on independence and on mobility, more so than on the use of private assets. However, the larger point, I feel, still stands in regards to the fact that there should be improvements to the way in which compliance is addressed. Whether withholding is feasible in all cases, also to hinge on the question with withholding by banks, my preference for that specific approach relates really mostly to the fact that it's one way of localizing the question of withholding and bypassing the situation where you would potentially have to rely on a foreign withholding agent that may not have, for example, a permanent establishment in the state that requires withholding.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Serhat Romani, who is Assistant Professor of Tax Law at our university and who is also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I wanted to mention that this is the very first time I'm in an assessment committee of a PhD, and I am more than grateful to be in your assessment committee because I really enjoyed reading this PhD. I think that it's a very complex work that the research question and the statement was very clear, but the methodology that you adopted to try to tackle and bring solutions to it was very rich and very complex. I mean, you did not only take a legal or substantive legal analysis, but you also took an approach from tax policy perspective. And I would also dare to say, even from behavioral science perspective, especially when dealing with the reasons why taxpayers did not comply with their tax obligations, which, by the way, this part, I think, is part 2.1 and part 2.2. Those were my favorite ones to read. And the question I have for you it actually revolves around this topic, because one of the factors that you talk about and explain regarding the tax compliance is tax literacy, and you seem to take an approach especially focused on the knowledge of the taxpayer. You mentioned there are 3 factors that make tax compliance like awareness, knowledge, and informed decision making. But I think that you did not take into account like the other side of the coin, which is the way tax norms are written, which is actually an influential issue for a taxpayer. Not only the active knowledge that it might have, but also the facilities that the legislator puts for the taxpayer. So the way tax norms are written, I think it's related to the right to understand tax law and the right to have clear legislation, which is ultimately linked to the principle of legal certainty. So I was curious to know what is your opinion on the matter regarding the taxation of platform workers. So why didn't you take it into account actively in your thesis, and actually what do you think, maybe is it not necessary for this matter? So what's your opinion on that, and if so, what would be a solution that you might propose if necessary? That's my question.
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for this question. Tax literacy is indeed one, not necessarily determinant of non-compliance or compliance, but a factor which can influence to what extent taxpayers can actually be compliant. And indeed, I focus primarily on considerations related to the taxpayer himself. So in other words, I think it would be fair to say that I internalize the question of tax literacy rather than focusing on the external context. Really, that was only a methodological choice that I made for the purposes of that part of the manuscript, because I was focusing on the characteristics of the taxpayers themselves more so than the system, hence the internalization. However, I do completely agree with you that there are several external determinants of tax literacy. One of them would be the complexity of the laws, but I think a more prevalent one refers to the culture of the state concerned, because there are countless states, and this could turn into an empirical argument, but most states which have very complex tax systems by reason of their sophistication also have comparatively high levels of tax literacy. So complexity is not necessarily a primary determinant, more so than the culture of a specific state. I also briefly touch upon this as part of my thesis, that taxpayer environments matter and cultural considerations matter. The environment within which these issues come up will make a considerable difference. As regards the true relevance of tax literacy and how this could be addressed, what I do argue as part of my thesis is that the most obvious link would be with taxpayer engagement and education initiatives, which are increasingly more popular. there are several reasons for this. One of these reasons is also because tax administrations increasingly try to uptake a service-oriented approach. They are gradually trying to move away from the view that they are strictly an enforcer of the law and increasingly to be a facilitator of compliance. And one of the ways in which this is achieved is through deploying taxpayer engagement and education resources. So in spite of the fact that I argue quite extensively in favor of naturalizing tax compliance as far as possible, the argument does still stand that tax literacy is important, because having a tax system which works in the background, as the OECD describes it, a system that is seamless and where everything can just be recorded in real time, should not, at least in my view, be equated with the argument that taxpayers should be dissociated or disengaged from the tax system. There are many reasons for why accountability on the taxpayer's part and active engagement with their tax obligations is relevant. One of them refers to preserving the integrity and the public trust in the tax system. So, in my view, regardless of what the future will be on the measures that are introduced, whether compliance by design remains aspirational, which it might, because it's something that the OECD has been discussing for nearly 10 years now, and the tone has consistently been aspirational, more so than showing true progress in that area. But regardless of this, and regardless how far compliance processes are to be naturalized, tax literacy will always matter, because engagement, active engagement of legal subjects with their tax obligations will also matter.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor van den Hurk. Professor van den Hurk is Professor of European Corporate Income at our university, and he is also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you very much, dear candidate. First of all, well written, was very nice to read it. Secondly, correct me if I'm wrong, we are discussing platforms. So what we do need to know is who earns what. That's actually what all your thesis is going about. And you have many approaches in how you can get more information, get a more proactive attitude of the taxpayer, etc., to fulfill that need to have these people being taxed. And I'm thinking, we know all the platforms. We have Tax 7. We have all kinds of data analysis tools. We do have blockchain. So we can actually quite easily find out who is earning what. Next question can of course be, that person earns that money with a certain transaction. Is it applicable to a source of law, source of income, I mean, because that's also very decisive. If so, that person, we can tax that person adequately. So you describe a few things in your thesis, amongst others, about that platforms should be allowed to enter databases from the government with respect to taxpayers, if I recall well. And I'm thinking, why would we need these disproportionate instruments to get information which is actually already available via Tax 7, blockchain theory, whatever? Can you explain that to me, please?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. As regards DAC 7, there are several issues with it, some specific to DAC 7, others more broadly as regards DAC. As regards DAC as a whole, the framework itself, at the end of the day, it is an instrument that, since it first came into play in 2013, 2014, it has been extended almost every year consistently. Even before we had a final version of DAC 7, the discussions about DAC 8, which are still ongoing, were already...
Alice, sorry. I was just using this as an example. What I need to say is, what we need to discuss is, there are so many possibilities to retrieve that necessary information. Tax 7 is just an example. There's blockchain, sheer theory. You can work with withholding taxes, horizontal monitoring with all the platform economies.
Well, with blockchain specifically, is one approach which is consistently being discussed also as part of the OECD to some extent. One issue with blockchain is that it's also part of an aspirational discussion for several reasons. Blockchain lacks maturity, although it safeguards comprehensiveness of information, and it's very much in line with what I discussed in relation to compliance by design, having comprehensive information safeguarded in real time. The only issues with blockchain are the lack of maturity, the reluctance for it to be implemented on a broader scale, the issues related to how it can be implemented in also a manner that is cost effective, because many times blockchain is very energy intensive. And finally, in a more legalistic sense, blockchain really refers to online ledgers, and there could potentially be questions about the ownership of specific ledgers depending on where they are. But that said, at least in an aspirational sense, I do wholeheartedly agree that blockchain would be part of the solution.
Okay, then let's now go to withholding taxes. So we know the platforms, so we can oblige the platforms to levy withholding tax. So the person's earning income, which is non-taxable due to a lack of source, can retrieve, can get it back, and the other person sees it as a withholding tax on income. So, one answer. Go ahead.
May
it's
I?
allowed.
It is allowed.
I'm so sorry I got this question so late, because this is a very extensive topic. I argue it is possible to have withholding in regards to platforms. There are some enforceability issues there, however, and there are also considerable issues related to the fragmentation of income, because many workers earn income for different platforms at the same time. So a cohesive framework for withholding is quite difficult to achieve as regards platforms.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Alice Michaela Draghici, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee, here present, will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company, here in this auditorium and online, await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and night. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and night. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
thinking about it.
Alice Michaela Draghici. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Sousa de Man is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Please all rise.
Thank you. Dear Alice, first I have to ask you a question. Actually, more than one. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I do.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Alice Michaela Draghici, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the director, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Dear Ms. Candidate, former candidate, dear Dr. Draghici, dear Liz, I have to come here today, and I told you yesterday, it will not be a problem. You will not fail, no? Yeah, please. Thanks, yeah. I have to congratulate you an excellent thesis, very sovereign defense of your PhD. You, especially you, your parents, your brother, all friends and colleagues, and also your supervisors are very proud of you, what you have achieved. I remember now when you were visiting me the first time in my office, you came and you said, "Oh, come on, I'm so bored by my work in Luxembourg as a tax advisor," but I always understand because it's in a certain way a boring work. Well, Hans perhaps has a different opinion about that, but I understood it very well, especially if you are working in Luxembourg. And you said, well, is there a chance perhaps to do something here in Maastricht where you have studied and where you felt always good, I think, no? And is there an alternative for me? Can I do something? And we were speaking about the PhD project, and we had a very nice talk, no? And and I had a very strong feeling already at that time that it makes absolutely sense to support you as much as I can. And you were one of our best students, no? I think one of the best master students we ever had. I don't know whether Raimund has the statistics of the grades of the master students, but I'm sure that you are in the top 5. No? And that was very crucial because you had so high grades, it was possible to apply within the faculty round for a PhD place to work at the university. And you are the first student of tax law that really got now such, was chosen by in the faculty competition as one of the students that get a contract for writing a PhD. I don't know whether we have somebody afterwards who achieved that, but so I think that was unique. But that is due to the fact that you are so excellent in all aspects. No? And I think that we are here now, and that we see what you have achieved. That shows that it was a very good investment first, but also I think it shows that the faculty made a very good decision in this case. Over the years when you began then, we became friends, and it was always a pleasure to work together with you, because you are so always friendly, you are so dedicated to your work, also to your personal relationships, and you are always prepared to help out. And so I think you are really one of the ideal colleagues you want to have. And I even remember that you once helped me with grading exams, and the only condition was to bring them to Cologne, to the house of your father. But that was, of course, also a good opportunity to meet your father, no? And your mother. If there is anybody who wants at least to grade exams in future, no, that has nothing to do with this past service, no? Now the situation has changed. Well, over the years you have written a very impressive book. No? Some people say that it is too lengthy, too many pages, but actually I do not know what we could have left away. Everything makes sense. And also you told me yesterday that you cannot see the book anymore and that you are tired of the whole topic. But you know, Giorgio said it, no? It's not about only sharing economy or something like that. It's about tax in general, no? So you will see in some weeks, no, when you have got a little bit of distance, that you have done something very interesting, and that you have to continue with that, no? Also to make your book and your findings and your results known in the whole law and tax community. And of course, no, I think what also Giorgio addressed, I think we are only at the beginning of a big development. No? I think these business strategies, these business models will continue. We will have similar continue. So we have to continue, especially your young people. You have to find new ways how to make sure that the taxes, that everybody is paying the fair tax. Oh, if I can say that in this way. And you will find your role, I'm sure. As supervisors, and I'm speaking here also for Fernando, we had a fantastic time with you because we had nothing to do. Now that is now a little bit perhaps going too far, but you always delivered on time. When we said, okay, we get the manuscript, no, chapter 2 or 3 at that moment, then we had it at that moment. And the only problem for us was to read so much stuff. No? But I had that never before, that I was reading a PhD where I was saying, well, I cannot make any comments. No? Perhaps I can say there is a comma failing or something like that. No? But it was always perfect. So we had a really good time. No? Of course, we always were criticizing that it was a little bit too lengthy. No? I remember that, but this was more because we were also selfish. No? We didn't want to read so many pages. That was quite clear. And but at the end, we enjoyed, and I think the result justifies all the investment we have done. But of course, no, because all the work and the workload, no, with reading, we are now also free that it is finished. No? Yeah. Well, what remains is to wish you all the best for the future. I'm very happy that I know that you have found your place within the text department here, and that you like the city of Maastricht like I do, and that you feel well. No? That gives you the room for further developments and plans, and you can determine new research projects. And I think there is a really interesting future in front of you. And I know that we will remain in contact, and you know that I will always be prepared to help you if you need help. And if it is only to lend you my ears. But now it's time to celebrate. And the only thing before we are now going to drink and eat and have fun is, please, I have one issue that I would like to ask you. Do me this favor. Take time for getting enough sleep next week. And I really would like to ask Raimund to think about how you can give her a little bit time to sleep, because I assume that you did not sleep much during the last days. Well, congratulations. We have now to celebrate the PhD hero, Dr. Michaela Draghici. Thanks.
Dear Dr. Draghici, also on behalf of Maastricht University and its Faculty of Law, many congratulations on the degree that you just acquired. We just heard your supervisors say that they are very proud of you. Your paronyms are very much proud of you. Our faculty is also very much proud of you. And in fact, it's the third academic degree that you acquired here at our faculty and university. And I always say it's the highest one we have available. There's nothing that goes beyond becoming a doctor here at this university. So many congratulations for that. Congratulations also to your paronyms and to your family and friends present here in this auditorium and watching this ceremony online. Before I officially close the ceremony, I have one practical remark to make, which is that we are going to take now the traditional photo of the young doctor together with her paronyms and her supervisors and the committee and the beadle. And that is going to take place at the stairs of this beautiful building. And I just want to ask everyone who is present here in this aula, first of all, to give priority to the cortege when leaving this aula, and then to go already to the reception, where we then will join you after the taking of the photo. And with that, and again, congratulations to you. With that, I close this academic ceremony.